Hello all, and welcome to today's professional development webinar on tips and techniques on effective presentations. My name is Vanessa Guerra. I am a researcher at the College of Architecture and Urban Studies at Virginia Tech, and I'm going to be facilitating today's session. Before I introduce today's presenter, I would like to quickly remind you that the Regional Studies Association is the global and interdisciplinary network for urban and regional research, development, and policy. The RSA supports its members with research, funding schemes, networking, publishing opportunities, and spaces to grow research and careers. Today's webinar, which is part of the Professional Development Webinar Series, is one of the many initiatives the RSA put in place to support its members and the wider community during the current global crisis. Other initiatives include the Region Cities Industry Webinar Series that delivers monthly sessions by experts in the fields of regional studies, science, planning, or policy, and a new grant scheme of around 4,500 euros, which funds research on how regions, cities, and industry address the impact of COVID-19. So if you would like to learn more about this and other initiatives, please make sure you visit the RSA website. Finally, I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on the RSA members lounge afterwards. And since we would love to hear from you, please make use of the Q&A function for questions. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce today's presenter. Rachel Franklin is a professor of geographical analysis in the Center for Urban and Regional Development Studies at Newcastle University. She is also a fellow of the Alan Turing Institute and visiting scholar at the Population Studies and Training Center at Brown University. She is the current editor of Geographical Analysis, and prior to joining Newcastle in 2018, she was the Associate Director of Brown's Initiatives in Spatial Structures in the Social Sciences. Her research focuses in spatial demography and the interplay between spatial analytics and demographic change, in particular, quantifying patterns, sources, and impacts of spatial inequality. Welcome, Rachel. It is a pleasure to have you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share my screen here. And start my slides. Thank you, Vanessa, for that super nice introduction, and thank you to the RSA for having me. So what I will do is speak for about the next 15 minutes about my advice for giving an effective presentation. And the way I've framed this is to think about two kinds of tips and two kinds of techniques, but they really come down to just two things. One is always, always, always think about your audience. The reason you give a presentation is for your audience to leave with something, but always be thinking about what's in it for you. And a lot of my advice is about all of the different ways that there is something in it for you when you give a presentation. So I think the first piece of advice here, and actually, I'm still new to this Zoom presentation. I'm going to move my face out of the way so I can see my words. All right, so the first piece of advice that I have, and probably the very most important, this is why it's number one, is to think about what your takeaway is from your presentation. This is usually what your main conclusions are from your research, but sometimes it's something else, policy questions or advice that you want to give, requests that you want to make. But if you can't identify what those takeaways are in a sentence or two, then chances are your audience is going to have trouble as well. And you're likely to talk for 15 minutes like I am today, or half an hour, or even 45 minutes or an hour. And so you always, I think, have to be thinking about how are you keeping your audience's attention for that period of time, right? So you may know what your takeaways are for your presentation, hopefully you do, but an important question is whether by the time you get to that point in your presentation, will people still be paying attention to you, or will they be on their phones looking at Twitter, reading their email? And so when you're building your presentation and thinking about how you're going to talk, how you're going to construct your slides, what you really want to be thinking about is how am I holding on to the attention of the audience for the really important takeaways that I've got. let's see, hold on. Second, and I think this is really key here, is knowing your audience, right? This falls into two broad categories. One is, what are they expecting from you? Are they expecting a lot of technical detail? And here I'm speaking mainly to quantitative researchers. Will they be expecting to see models? Do they want to see actual equations? Do they want to see tables? Or if they see a table and an equation, are they going to sort of shut off and start looking around the room at other people? This is your job to think about what the audience is going to be expecting. And the example I gave here is, if you don't show model results in a big table, will they be disappointed or are they going to be pleased? And I think if you can think that through a little bit, that will help in the design of your slides. Disciplinary culture, I think, is also really important. So some disciplines, such as economics or history, have a very clear culture about how presentations are performed. So it is very much about going on stage and knowing what the audience is going to be expecting from you. This is really important for, say, geographers and planners and economists, because we don't perform in the same ways. So for many of us, if we're interrupted continuously, it's a sign that we haven't been clear enough, whereas others expect to be interrupted constantly, and that is how they've designed their presentation. So knowing a little bit about the disciplinary culture is helpful. Then there are also the more practical aspects of giving a talk. Some of this is language fluency. So for example, I can't see any of you right now. I can see from the chat that you come from all over the world. And for many of you, English probably is not your first language. And so I have to remind myself as I'm talking to you, not to go too fast, to think about the terms and the language that I use. Some of this also comes down to thinking about whether you're talking to students or academics. This is the takeaway. How do you make sure that you're giving the information to people in a way that they're going to digest it and use it? And I think increasingly, we think more about basic audience needs like hearing and visuals. So making sure if you're designing visuals that they are appropriate for colorblind people or for people whose vision may not be so good. Can the people in the back of the room see the map that you've put up on your slides? If they've given you a microphone, use the microphone. And I think this is something that, especially at the beginning of our careers, even me, mid-career, I'm not a fan of microphones. I find them uncomfortable. I don't like the way my voice is magnified, but we're not doing it for us. We're doing it for our audience. And there are people in the audience who really appreciate being able to hear clearly what you're saying. It's also important to know what's in it for you, right? Sometimes this is practical. Like, do you want a job from these people? If you want a job, then you need to make sure that you're presenting yourself and your research in a way that people can see you as a future successful colleague. It's also about, of course, always making a good impression. You never know who in the audience is going to remember the way you presented, the topic you presented on, and be in touch with you later. If you're looking for feedback, design your slides in such a way that people can ask questions and provide advice afterwards. And I think always try to take questions in the most constructive way possible. Sometimes people will voice them in a really critical way, and that can be difficult for us at any stage of our career, but try to remember to take that advice on board and use it to improve both the research and the presentation style. And then, most importantly, we have to give talks to get better at giving talks. I'm still improving, and I've been doing this for 20 years. And so I think at the very beginning of our careers, every time somebody asks you if you would like to give a presentation, say yes, right? And attend as many talks as you can, right? And this is especially important when we talk about job talks or talks where we're interviewing for a job. Go to as many of those types of talks as you can so that you know both how people present, but also how the audience reacts and what the audience tends to be looking for. Know your content. This is, of course, important. Practice your introductions. How are you going to say hello to people? Practice the tricky transitions. Practice talking about results. I find that if I've written a paper already, it helps to read that through because I'll have already thought about how I'm introducing the topic and how I'm transitioning from section to section. If there are tricky bits like talking about results, practice those, right? Try to imagine the questions you might get. As you might have gathered, practice, practice, practice. Right? Know what the purpose of your talk is. Are you trying to persuade people about your findings? Is this more of a scientific or academic audience, in which case there will be a culture to how research is typically presented, and it helps to fit into that culture. If you're looking for networking, then think about how what you're doing can connect to other ongoing research in your field. If it's community engagement, that what you want is for people to leave excited about your topic and understanding why it matters for the real world, which is slightly different from what we would do in an academic setting where we're really trying to persuade people about the importance, but also the quality of the research. And I think increasingly we talk about elevator pitches or short presentations. It's useful to always be able to succinctly describe your research in a minute or two, right? So get in the habit of being able to do that. Know the tools of the trade. So for example, I'm giving a webinar using Zoom today. This is the second webinar that I've ever given using Zoom, and I'm still finding my way around the technology. The same thing will happen in the real world. So getting used to clickers, how you advance from slide to slide, how your voice sounds with a microphone, speaking in a big room or a little room. Will you be standing or sitting as you talk? And then of course, how we design our presentation slides. So you don't always have to have presentation slides. Often we do though when we're presenting research. And I know there will be others in this series who will talk about communicating information, but mostly you want your slides to match the purpose of the talk. You want your takeaway to be clear, but you want your audience to be able to extract information from your slides as you're talking, right? So structure should match context. Know the basics. So this is basic presentation 101. Typically, we estimate about a slide a minute. So if somebody has invited you to give a talk for 45 minutes, which is a sort of a normal academic length, don't do 60 or 70 slides. What I often see people do is that they'll have 70 slides and they'll say, it's okay, some of them I'm not going to sit on for very long. I'm going to move very quickly. But in reality, this doesn't happen. And if you've signposted your slides and people can see at the bottom of the screen that you're on slide 5 out of 70, 15 minutes into the presentation, you're going to start to lose them even if the information on that slide is interesting, all right? Depending on who your audience is, I would say no tiny tables. Certainly, if you have a tiny table with lots of small numbers on your slide, then what you're doing is performing research and not conveying results. So there may be reasons to put tables in your slides, to convey that you've done all of the requisite research and that your results are robust. But you need to understand the audience isn't going to be looking at every number and digesting that in the time that you've given them. This holds especially for slides that have figures and maps as well. Be realistic in how much time it's going to take to show someone a map and then tell them what the takeaway is, what the important information is from that figure that you've shown them. I find that with tables or with figures that having arrows or highlights or circles that basically point the audience eyes to where they should be looking is helpful. And I would say limit the bells and whistles, right? So sound effects or slides that whoosh from one to the other, they look nice, but they distract the audience from why they're there. And why they're there is to see you and hear about what you have to talk about. And if you take nothing else away from my talk, know the time limits and keep to them. Right? There is nothing that kills a reputation or makes a poor impression or makes the takeaway be ignored more than not keeping to the time limits, no matter who you are. I think it's also important to know yourself, right? So as I'm talking to you right now, inside my head, part of my brain is thinking about how I'm talking, what I'm doing with my hands, how I'm sitting. And your job as you present more is to learn what tics you have. I call them tells here on this slide, but what do you tend to do? Is it to use the same words over and over? Is it to fidget with your hands or your feet? Do you shake things around in your pockets? Catch yourself doing that and stop, right? It's also important to make eye contact with the audience. This is really difficult for me here, right? So this is a new form of communication with people, but often when we're in the same room, the audience is looking for some sign that it's a give and take in terms of communication, that I'm not just pontificating or lecturing, I'm saying something and waiting a little bit for a response, even if it's nonverbal from the audience. Thinking about your voice and your tone. Some of us become really monotonous when we talk. Some of us, our voice changes register when we talk. Learn to recognize when your voice is doing that. Learn to recognize when you're talking too quickly and slow down. Right? If there's something really important that you want people to look at on your slides or an important takeaway, give them the space, pause, and allow them to process that information before you move on. If you find yourself getting really nervous, right, which is usually what's driving the voice going too fast or the change in the register. Just take a deep breath, slow down, and start again. I have a couple of tips here too. Make sure you're fed and watered. Sometimes if it's a really high stakes, first time presenting at a conference or a big conference presentation or a keynote, a job interview, we have a tendency to forget the basics, like sleeping well the night before, making sure you've eaten something so your blood sugar isn't too low, making sure you're hydrated so your tongue doesn't stick inside your mouth. And almost always there's someone like Vanessa for me keeping time for us. And so every once in a while, as you're making eye contact with the room, look at that person to see whether everything is going okay. In a conference setting, that person is going to tell you when you're starting to run out of time. And so you want to make sure that you're looking at them so they can give you that feedback when you need it. Say no to nerves, right? So I'm nervous now. I was nervous before I gave this talk. So the nerves never go away. And most people would say that a little bit of nervousness is good. It makes us more alert as we're presenting, but too much nerves, and a lot of us will sort of freeze and our brains won't be as nimble moving from thought to thought, or maybe we'll have more trouble finding words. So what we want to do is to protect the quality of the presentation against being nervous. So one thing that really helps is just to practice. This means going through your slides repeatedly. It means giving your talk to friends or family. It means giving the talk to yourself in your hotel room before you go to a conference session. I think for many of us, it helps if we have friends in the room that we can look at who will sort of give us a supportive smile if we're worried about how our presentation is going. But then I would say, always have a plan B in case of anxiety or in case the technology doesn't work the way it's supposed to. The easiest plan B is to be able to give the talk without slides, right? Could you talk at least some of the time without any slides? If you freeze, what are you going to do to get yourself going again? I found when I was first starting off 20 years ago that having a few more words on the slide, which is generally a no-no. People say, don't put too many words on your slide. I found it reassuring that worst case scenario, if I froze and my brain wasn't working, at least the slides would reflect the work that I had done. So I would say it is a tip if you're really worried about your nerves. Okay, and then a little bit of bonus advice. Don't forget to read the room. This means as you're talking, don't forget to look at how people are reacting to what you're saying. And often they're really supportive. They'll nod, they'll smile, and that'll sort of, it gives you energy to continue presenting. But also if people seem to be tuning out, it might help you to sort of reorient yourself in the middle of the presentation. Watch what others do. So I highly advise going to conference sessions before you give a talk and looking to see not only how other people present and what you like and what you don't like, but also how audiences react to presentations. Envision yourself giving the talk. I think imagining how it's going to feel can really help with the nerves. And then this is, if there's a number 2 takeaway, it's that the talk doesn't end when you're done, and especially for conference sessions, always be thinking that you need to be the audience member that you would hope to have, right? And as a tip, I would say at the end, debrief. Debrief with friends who were in the audience with you, but also to yourself. Be your worst critic, but also your greatest friend. Think about what went wrong and what you want to do better next time, right? And remember that a lot of giving a presentation is about conveying information. It's about the takeaways, but it's also a journey, right? It's a little bit about self-discovery, figuring out who we are as researchers and regional research practitioners, but also improving our speaking skills and always making improvement. And so I think if we've got that process where we're doing the debrief after a talk, we're always identifying ways that we might do something different or even innovative the next time we give a talk. And that's it. Very quick. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rachel, for this great insight and tips. I'm sure these are going to be helpful for all of us next time we have a presentation. We have a lot of questions from our attendees. I'm going to start with the questions that we have here. There are 2 questions that complement each other, and they refer to the material that you bring with you to your presentations. So one question says, could you advise adding pictures to slides, or do you think it is better to stick just to the written content? And we have another question that refers how much text is it advised to add to your slides, if it is okay to put only bullet points, or how do we balance that?
Yes, so a lot here depends both on, this is why I divided the advice between you and your audience. So part of this depends on what the audience is expecting to see from you. And part depends on your level of comfort. If you are comfortable in most academic settings with less text, then less text is going to be better. But it's going to require a lot of preparation on your end, right? So the presentations, especially keynotes, for example, that are really good are ones that I think have no text, right? They only have figures. Maybe they have a really interesting table, but that means that for every slide that you have with just a map, for example, you in your head have to have everything prepared that you were going to say about that because it won't be on the slide. So the advice generally is to have less text on slides, and it does look nicer, but if you get nervous or you don't have some sort of written backup, then I think it can just increase the anxiety for some people. So I think knowing yourself is really important in this case.
All right. We have another question that became very popular in the Q&A chat, and it says, what do you do if people ask you questions that you don't know the answer?
Well, hopefully you get some questions that force you to think about your material in a new way. Again, this depends a little bit what the purpose of your talk was, right? So if you're looking for feedback, and I would say as a good practice, always just have a piece of paper and a pen and write down the questions, because you never know when later this might be useful to you when you're actually writing a paper or thinking about presenting the material again. When your adrenaline is really high, you're thinking about getting through the presentation and you're not thinking about using whatever you learned during the presentation. So if you write it down, you can keep it with you. But whether you're teaching or giving any kind of talk, eventually you just get a question either that is either legitimately completely from outer space, right? The person maybe wasn't listening, or they're not enough of an expert to know what they're talking about, or it's just a legitimately hard question. You know, for example, something that you should have done with your model or a variable or something about the data and you haven't thought about that. In all of those cases, it is absolutely fine to make eye contact and be relaxed and say, that is a really interesting question. I hadn't thought about it like that. I haven't thought of this. I'm not sure I understand. Is this what you're actually asking me? Because this is how I've thought about it, right? So then it becomes a little bit more of a conversation. This doesn't always happen, but in a really nice interaction between audience and speaker, what you're getting is an interaction and a sharing of information. It's a dialogue, a conversation, where somebody asks you a question and you say, well, this is how I've thought about it, and they might follow up, right? So don't be afraid of the questions, and don't be afraid of the questions that you can't immediately answer. Point out that that is just something that you haven't thought of and something that you will think about in the future, and practice saying that. Know how to just let it flow so that you don't seem like you feel threatened by what's happening, or that you feel like you're not expert enough. These questions, unless somebody is not a nice person, these questions generally are not meant to make you feel like you don't belong or that you're stupid. So don't take it, try not to take it that way. Try to just roll with it and say thank you.
Yeah, that is really helpful. And I guess thinking about it as a conversation, as a way of getting feedback and bringing input from the audience is very helpful in this. And that brought us to another question that is very common as well. And it says, how do you deal when you don't have any questions once you're done presenting? And could that be a sign that your presentation wasn't effective?
So this depends a lot on culture. So where I was before I came to Newcastle was in an interdisciplinary center. So sociologists and public health researchers and economists and historians and anthropologists would all give presentations. And over 8 years, it became clear to me that economists, anyway, North American economists, they really expect to be interrupted from the beginning. And that actually they begin to feel uncomfortable if they're not being asked questions, because it suggests that people maybe don't think their research is so good, right? It is a little bit more disappointing when you've given a conference presentation, for example, and then at the end, nobody says anything, right? And then sometimes you're not sure. Is it because they weren't paying attention? Is it because you did something wrong? Is it because it's right before lunch or right after lunch? So hopefully the chair and hopefully the audience are thinking about this. This is something that I think is a little bit less your job, but of course does affect you, because then you wonder what you've done to make you not get questions. But one thing to think about is to have conclusions that are partly the conclusions from the research, but also avenues for further research, or things that aren't done yet, or things that you're still thinking through, that allow the audience members something to grab onto to think about a question, right? So you're helping them, facilitating the discussion a little bit there.
Yeah, well, that's a great tip too. We have another question that it's about how to present, and it's asking if do you consider appropriate using humor during your presentation? Appropriate humor, of course.
That's a complicated answer, because I find, also having taught for a long time, that it is the way that I tend to diffuse my tension. I think humor is fine. I think, for example, getting started with a presentation, often people want to have an anecdote or something that's going to break the ice. And that ice breaking really does perform a role. It helps everyone relax into the presentation. The way to use it effectively, I think, is to not necessarily expect laughs, right? Depending on the culture, depending on the timing, or how you've expressed something, it may not work. And so you might have internally been counting on everyone to laugh at something you've said, and now they haven't, and now you don't really know what to do next. So I think it's absolutely appropriate to use humor. Or, you know, sometimes people have cartoons that they put to illustrate a research question or a policy question. There are these little tools that we use to help build community in the room when we're talking and someone and a group is listening to us. So I don't have a problem with humor. Think about it before you open your mouth ever. Think about how it could sound to somebody who is not you, right? But that's just normal being sensitive to a wider audience. Yeah.
Makes sense, yeah. Now we have a lot of questions on the preparing phase. So we have a question here that says, what are your suggestions for practicing and rehearsing a presentation? And are extra notes okay during presentation? Is it okay to bring with you a couple of notes and read them while you're presenting?
So I've seen everything. I've seen people write out the entire talk. I've seen people use note cards. In PowerPoint, it's possible to use what's called presenter view, where everything that you've put in the little notes at the bottom of your slides, when you go to slideshow, you say show presenter view, not on Zoom, but in real life, usually you're able to see your notes and able to see the slides. I think of those as falling into a plan B category, in the sense that you don't want to be relying on them. They're there in case something happens and you freeze, right? And you're really nervous and things aren't working. They're not meant to be the main way that we present information. So ideally, we've practiced. And again, I also know people who practice in lots of different ways. The advice tends to be to speak out loud and to give the entire talk and to give it to people. One thing that I've learned that isn't in the slides, and either may be obvious or maybe isn't, is not to always use completely fresh material every time you give a talk, right? And this is something that I discovered only in mid-career, that actually the better presentations will be the ones that you've given a few times, because there you know where the joke is needed. There you know where the transition is needed. In other words, you gave the talk and it was not a 10 out of 10, it was an 8 or a 9 out of 10. And the next time you give the talk, you fix something on it. So I highly recommend, if possible, giving the same talk in lots of different situations so that you sort of know how it works and you know how you work with that material. What I do is put my slides on slide view, and in my head, I tend to run through what I'm going to say. I do try to think about what I want to say at the beginning, because if I'm comfortable with my introduction, usually that helps me be comfortable through the rest of the presentation. And I tend to think a little bit about about transitions, about going from one section of material to another, because that can also be where you lose people. And I try to be accurate in how much time I'm going to have to spend thinking about or presenting a table or a map, for example, because that is where, as a geographer, I end up spending lots of time showing a map of the United States, and then I've used up half my presentation time. So basically, practicing, but also sort of pretending to be the audience at the same time and asking yourself, well, is that going to work or should I do it this way, right?
Very interesting. I will follow up with other questions that refer to that, but I just want you all, let you know that since we have lots of unanswered questions, we will overrun it slightly. So I'm going to pick up a couple of extra questions, and they refer to the structure of the presentation. Still in the phase of how do I prepare a presentation, we have people asking how do you structure a presentation? What are your recommendations to structure it if your target is community participation? And if you have any resources that you could suggest on how to organize a presentation effectively.
So I have at the end of my slides some suggestions for further reading, which I can either post on Twitter or maybe RSA can post directly for me. So there's lots of advice. If you Google, for example, just how to give an academic presentation, lots of people have their thoughts. And you'll notice that there are some things that everyone agrees on, for example, not filling your slides with text. But then you get the marginal extra piece of information from different people who see things slightly differently. So I would recommend, if I were talking to my students, just relax some evening or afternoon and just read this material just to see what it has to say and how it resonates with you. In terms of structure of presentation, again, this is going to depend a little bit what your audience is and also what the purpose of your talk is, right? So if it's a conference presentation in the social sciences, there is a fairly standard structure, almost like a fairy tale or a novel. There's a narrative arc that the talk is going to follow. It's going to have an introduction, sort of a scene setting. Usually there will be background research, then some literature, then what you're doing, if you've got data or models, and then results, discussion, conclusion. And it always goes about like that. The question for you is, where do you want the most feedback? What's the most interesting to you? Where is the takeaway? Is the takeaway in the model results, or is the takeaway in the contribution to the literature? Chances are it cannot be a contribution everywhere. So you can't spend lots of time on background literature and lots of time on results. You'll run out of time and you'll be the person who doesn't finish all of their slides, and the takeaway will have been in those last few minutes and your audience will never see it, okay? If it's a job talk or you're interviewing for a job, then you're doing lots of things at once and your audience is more complicated because they're academics, but they're not all from your field, right? So they have expectations of what the level of intellectual content should be. But if they're not in your area, right, then you're going to have to provide the foundation for them to be able to understand where your contributions are, right? And here again, I would say, if you've taken the opportunity to give every presentation you can, and even to interview for jobs that are a little bit outside of your number one desired job, you will have had practice giving a job talk and answering those questions. So practice. And practice is not just practicing in your hotel room. Practice means going out and giving that kind of talk lots and lots and lots, so you know how it works, and then you build your confidence, right? But yeah.
Yeah, well, those are great tips, and practicing is essential for giving effective presentations. But sometimes, no matter how much you practice, you get nervous or things can happen and you run out of time. So we have another question here that says, what should you do if you miss time and run out of time? Like, what is a good tip to solve the situation?
So there are two things that you can do. The first is to have practiced realistically, so you know where you're going to want to spend longer talking and also how long you think your presentation is going to run. I have a little clock sitting next to me right here. Some people will look at their watch or put their phone next to them when they're talking. So you want to have backup to help make sure you don't run out of time. In many situations, that chair of the session is also going to start getting uncomfortable. They will either hold a sign up for you, or they're going to start moving around, or they might even stand up next to you. If it comes to that, that means that you have really pushed the limits of your audience and what the expectations are for your talk. And it happens to all of us. Every one of us has run out of time before, but it's something that we want to learn over time to get better at. So it is definitely something that we work towards improving. If it happens to you, probably what is most useful is to know at the end of your presentation where's the point that you can skip to without having lost the takeaway, right? So is it the last 3 slides, the last 2 slides, right? Where could you sort of skip over and get to the end and still leave people with something? You should know, though, that if you take too long, in some situations, they'll cut you off and you will not be able to finish at all. And then you'll feel bad and embarrassed. Your audience won't be happy. So yeah, so the most important thing is to practice, is to try not to do it. Yeah. And then to have an idea of where you could go to your last 2 slides, for example, and say, these are the things that I really, really wanted to get to. Yeah. And go easy on yourself. If it happens a few times, that's part of the learning process. One thing that I really wanted to convey in these slides is that this is a process, right? It isn't that you wake up one day and you're a fantastic presenter. It's that every time you give a talk, afterwards you say, what did I need to do better? Where would I like to be better? For example, my goal for myself now is the learning to give talks without the text on slides. And that means sometimes it goes really well, and sometimes it's more nerve-wracking, but it is the goal that I have for myself now. And so it is something that I practice at.
Such a good tip to evaluate your own presentation once you are done. So the presentation is done, and after that you need to think and reflect on what you did well or what could have been improved. That's a great tip. And we have time for one more question. And this question refers to how do we adapt now to all these online presentations. And it says, I'm going to be teaching students online this term. Any advices on how to keep them engaged?
Well, I think even before we have this shift, this momentous external shock, more than a shift to our teaching, there had been a lot of discussion about the flipped classroom, for example, and sort of where learning should be taking place. I teach mostly methods, and so for me, I was finding that I would use the class time for lecture and not for the hard part, which was sitting at the computer and sort of working through material. So I think thinking about, again, what the takeaways are from what you teach. Are you teaching about methods, or is it some sort of content or theory or policy? What is it that they need to learn at the end? And then how best do you get there? And in some countries, we have a lot of flexibility about how we get to that endpoint. And in other places, it's more rigid. You have to lecture, and then students have to go read on their own. In my experience, I have found that group work, for example, presentations, projects, all of these things that allow people to work with the material and then come back and present is helpful for their learning, but it also helps to break up the monotony of, for example, online lecturing. So thinking about giving your students an opportunity to put together presentations so that they all gain experience working with this technology, that's an option. Breaking people into small groups to go do a problem set, for example, and then report back. Pausing for discussion regularly, being aware that if you're sitting in front of a computer for hours and you're uncomfortable and tired, that of course your students are. So make sure that you've got breaks and that I think variety helps to keep the brain fresh, and experiment. But the biggest piece of advice I would give about sort of academic life and teaching and research presentations is don't be afraid to innovate. And this is, Regional Studies Association has lots about innovation. And I would say, try it. And if it doesn't work, it's not the end of the world. I mean, don't try a brand new technique for something that matters, like the job that you always wanted. But in general, for the lower stakes things, try teaching differently. Try giving a different sort of talk and see how it works, what doesn't work, and then learn from it and improve for the next time.
Well, yeah, those are some fantastic tips. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, so we are going to leave it there. Thank you, Rachel, for a great and insightful presentation. And thank you all participants who joined and interacted today. Please make sure you visit the RSA website and social media channels to find out about our next webinars and events. Thank you all and goodbye.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for listening. Goodbye.